Hi friends, hope you're doing well. I recently got into a little car accident. Someone hit me from behind. Thankfully I'm okay and all is well. But it got me thinking about this whole idea of fault. And it's so important these days for us to really take a moment to sit down and think about, what is fault, who is really liable, and more importantly, a legal term that we call negligence. I'm sure you've heard it, it's all around us, but I wanted to discuss it a little bit more in depth today. When do you actually have an actionable claim in a court of law for a negligence suit? Because otherwise everyone wants to sue for anything. You dropped your hat, you're negligent. You looked at me the wrong way, you're negligent. You laughed at me wrong, or you laughed too much and I'm hurt, and so you're negligent. It's something that I hear often, believe it or not. And so I thought, let's get into it. So what is negligence? Negligence in legal terms is a breach of a duty that causes damages. Now, each one of these words is very important in our analysis of whether negligence occurred or didn't occur. Let's start with the duty of care. When you talk about negligence, it's important that the person who made that breach or who committed that action that got you upset, they had to have a duty of care to you. They had to be in a position of trust and a position of service, commitment to provide something to you, the consumer, that put them in a situation where they have that duty to you. So examples of this would be, a doctor has a duty of care to their patient. The drivers out on the road, the one that hit me, the other day, had a duty of care to practice vigilance and carefulness, reasonable caution, not texting while they're driving. And this is why we have those new texting laws and the laws not to even hold your phone now when you're driving. This is all because the driver has a duty of care to other drivers on the road. So you have to have a duty of care. If there's no duty of care, doesn't matter what happened, there is no negligence. There has to be a breach, and that breach has to cause, and this is one of the other very important parts of this definition, it has to be either the direct cause, the actual cause, or the proximate cause. And so two different ways of saying it caused harm. The first one being that this direct cause, you put the scalpel and you cut my heart open and you left the scalpel in my heart when you were doing that surgery. Yes, that was the direct cause of the patient, having whatever issue following that, God forbid. The proximate cause is more in a situation where, okay, well, we can't say with 100,000% certainty, but it's more likely than not that this was the actual cause. There was no intervening factor. They use a lot of foreseeability test. They use a but-for test. But for this happening, this wouldn't have occurred, and therefore this was the proximate cause. So causation is a huge part of this. The final part of this definition is damages. And damages, a lot of people overlook this. They think, they spilled hot coffee on my hand. Nothing happened, but they had a duty to not do that to me, and therefore I'm gonna sue them for $100 million. Guess what? It's not gonna go anywhere. You didn't get hurt, nothing happened. You washed your hands and it was done. This is why I think it's important to have this discussion. It's because oftentimes we have these grandiose ideas in our head. I don't know if it's from the movies that we see or what it is, but we always think, oh my gosh, this happened, and yes, there was a breach, and yes, they had a duty to me, but there was no damages. And if there's no damages, then there's no negligence claim. And on that, I should also note, if there is a mitigation, like let's say they did put up signs and covered it up, and you still managed to somehow slip and fall, and let's say you did sprain your ankle, because they did take those steps to clean up the mess and to let the public know that this is an area to avoid, there is mitigation of that damage. So that is going to play a role in whatever litigation comes forward from it. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out, is this something worth going the route of hiring an attorney, paying legal fees, bringing a lawsuit to the other side, and going through months and months of litigation for, I don't know what's really going to come out of it. So that's why I think it's important to have this understanding of what does it mean to be at fault And more importantly, what does it mean to be legally negligent? Sometimes you can be at fault, but you're not legally negligent. So that's what we're here to discuss today. In my car accident issue, I was immediately like, who's negligent in this case? Who's at fault? Obviously, it was the person who hit me from behind. They were negligent. They had a duty, they breached that duty, and they hit my car. They caused the damages. My car is now sitting in a shop for God knows how long. Apparently, it's going to be weeks and weeks. And so there's that. Let's talk about tennis. Right now, the world number one, Jannik Sinner, just returned to the game of tennis. Thank God, I'm so excited. I'm so excited to see him play. My son plays a lot of tennis. It's big in our household. Anyway, Jannik Sinner was recently banned from the sport of tennis for a period of 3 months. And this was huge. I mean, this was earth-shattering news in the world of tennis. We had all the tennis stars were, tweeting and posting things and this and that about what their thoughts on the whole scandal of it was. We had stars like Nick Kyrgios. He was saying it's a sad day for tennis. The backstory is Jannik Sinner, they said that he was doping. Now this is a big claim to make, and I think he's done a fairly good job, from what I can tell, at showing his innocence and saying that, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. It just happened that my trainer on my team was using this cream that had this substance in it as she or he was massaging me. Little trace amounts of it made its way into my skin, into my body, and therefore my test came out positive, but this was not intentional. And intent is so critical to any discussion of negligence. I think people always have this idea that your intention is so important. They say, I did this, yes, it was an accident, I didn't mean to do this. But that's really important because in the discussion of legal negligence, intent has no place. It doesn't really matter whether you intended to do this or you didn't intend to do it. It only matters that those elements that I laid out earlier, that those elements are fulfilled and met. And if they are, regardless of having a good intent, you're negligent. So in this case, going back to Sinner, he said, it was not my intent. I didn't know about it. I certainly didn't, willingly have any kind of substance in my body. And, it was my team. They didn't know about it. And this went on and on. I think initially the tribunal said he didn't have any. They actually said there was no fault, there was no negligence. Later, unfortunately, the World Anti-Doping Agency, known as WADA, I believe, they said, hold on right there. We're not so convinced. And yes, you may not have personally intended to have this substance in your bloodstream or in your urine sample. I'm not sure if it was one or the other. But the fact is that your team member caused this and you're responsible for your team. There's such a stark contrast with other tennis players. Recently we saw Simona Halep go through something very similar. Initially they had put a 4-year ban, and this was later appealed. I think it was reduced to about 9 months. That's devastating for a tennis player. 9 months in the world of tennis is tremendous. This is the real life application of negligence, and this is how we see it play out around the world. But there are differences. In the case of Jannik Sinner versus Simona Halep, there are differences in their cases. For Sinner, I believe later they were saying that the prescription that was over the counter, it had a label on there about doping, and that if you were using this in a professional setting, that this is going to be considered doping. So there was some kind of warning on there, allegedly. In the case of Simona Halep, however, it's a little bit different. So here we have her coaching team saying, this was not her fault either. We actually ordered her collagen. She drank it unknowingly, and there was this substance in it, which none of us had any way to know. It wasn't written anywhere. So you would think that this would also not qualify as negligence. Why would Jannik Sinner's be clear of negligence, but hers, which is completely unknowing? There is no label. The coaching team is coming out and speaking. So where do we draw that line? I believe that later the tribunal was saying that based on expert testimony and analysis of her blood profile, patterns in her blood profile, that it seemed that they maybe didn't believe the explanation that they were getting. So ultimately, it's really interesting. I think in Sinner's side, they did a really good job of kind of dealing with it swiftly, head on, providing the cream immediately, and there wasn't this whole blood profile, abnormal blood profile issue that did exist in Simona Halep's case, which kind of really enhanced the scrutiny, and it enhanced their suspicions about whether this was like a one-time thing or whether her explanation was actually, valid. So I think there was some personal negligence that they were allotting to her case versus Sinner's case. They were kind of saying, okay, you yourself were not negligent, but you're going to take some blame here for your team's negligence, and therefore, he was punished, but nothing in comparison to Simona Halep's punishment. So I don't know those details. I was not in the courtroom and I haven't looked at those briefs or any of it, but from an outsider looking in, and especially in the world of tennis and for audiences around the world, you can see how this can become problematic very quickly. I think oftentimes people are like, well, you also don't want it to be a situation where now they're negotiating behind the scenes for potential doping issues. People are doping, but they're getting a little slap on the hand and then they're coming back. The other side of it is, well, this is a strict, no tolerance policy, and we have to adhere to it. We have to set an example for the rest of the world. But then there is, honestly, innocent mistakes too. And so you have to kind of balance that, I think, personally. You don't want to end someone's career based off of a mistake. That, I think, is something that really our court system strives, from what I have experienced, to do, is to find that balance between giving them a reasonable reward. In this case, the reward would not be with Simona Halep or Sinner. It would be for the tribunal and for the world of tennis to hold these people accountable. But the accountability has to be reasonable, right? You don't want to end someone's career based off of a proven honest mistake, regardless of how much negligence there was or wasn't. And I think hopefully that was carried out in the courtroom. But this was something that was really interesting, to me, because I thought, what an interesting case. There's negligence from all sides of it. It would be a great one to discuss with you all. I think it's definitely important in not just the world of tennis, but just our everyday life. I think it's important that we have these discussions, that we are kind of well-versed in what does it mean to have fault versus legal negligence. As I said earlier, there's a lot of cases where the person is clearly at fault, but are they legally negligent? That's what you're going to have to do this whole analysis on. But I hope that this discussion will make you think a little bit more the next time you quickly say, oh, they did this and they're negligent, or everybody throws this term out so easily, but it's not really the case. You can be at fault, but you're not necessarily legally negligent. So I will leave you with that. I hope this was helpful, or at the very least, I hope it was entertaining. Looking forward to chatting with you guys again soon. I'll see you next time. And please, please, please subscribe below. See you soon.